study importante au continent et au monde. I would like to acknowledge that the Africa Study Group is hosting this meeting from Ottawa on the traditional unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Je tiens à souligner que nous tenons cette session à partir d'Ottawa, territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe Algonquin. This session will be in English, and it will be moderated by Dr. Marsha Burdett, Deputy Chair of Africa Study Group. With a PhD in the political science from the Columbia University, New York, Marsha Burdett pursued an academic career followed by 25 years with Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has a long-standing interest in Africa that's well known, in particular Central Southern Africa. Her book, Zambia Between Two Worlds, and a series of articles focuses on the major economic transition of the country when its new leaders embarked on the nationalization of the copper industry, the country's main economic engine. Subsequent articles dealt with input industries for Zimbabwe's agriculture sector, and that was in the 1980s and 1990s. Marsha, I'm very happy that you are monitoring this session. Now I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Sheikh. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to our panelists for being with us today. As Sheikh said, I'm the Deputy Chairperson of the Africa Study Group. And I am delighted that we're able to have this session on South Africa. I'm just going to mention for 1 second that we know there are other very important African issues, particularly Sudan right now. And in fact, the Canadian Foreign Minister has just returned from a visit to Kenya, which was focused primarily on issues, regional issues from Sudan, and of course, the safety of Canadian citizens in that region. So we know that there's a lot of press coverage. However, this session is something we've been planning for quite a while, and it's part of a series that we've had on South Africa. This particular session is focused more with key speakers talking about the issues of Africa's importance to the continent of Africa and also in the international sphere. However, of course, they will touch on many other issues as well. So you can send your questions in French or English, and they will be translated as needed at the time of the Q&A section at the very end. Let me also mention that the webinar is a little bit different format than our normal format. What we will be doing is we'll have brief opening statements from both of our experts, and then we will move to a discussion format between them. So that will all take approximately an hour, and then there'll be approximately an hour at the end for questions and answers from our participants and our membership. So, so let me turn to today's discussion. For Africa watchers, a common phrase is that South Africa is the economic engine of sub-Saharan Africa. I think some Nigerians might contest this, but this is frequently said. Equally, whatever direction South Africa takes will greatly influence the fate of the continent. South Africa plays a large role in wider international politics as well, and this role has been changing over the last decade. For many analysts, South Africa's present political, social, and economic trends are very troubling. Today's webinar is going to focus on why is South Africa so critical to the continent and to the world.
For example, biological assets.
Right. So let me turn to our two, I'm going to give a quick summary of our two experts today, and then Dr. Van Heerden will give the first presentation. So Dr. David Hornsby is a professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and Associate Vice President at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He's a resident specialist in this area. Previously, David was based at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, where he was an associate professor of international relations and the assistant dean of humanities. David's research interests pertain to Canadian foreign policy in sub-Saharan Africa and South African foreign policy. Dr. Oscar Van Heerden is a scholar of international relations where he focuses on international political economy, with an emphasis on Africa, SADC in particular. He completed his PhD and master's studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and then he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Johannesburg, and then he entered as well active politics dating back to 1985 as a student and youth activist. He is an avid writer, analyst of contemporary politics in South Africa. He has served in numerous political capacities in the ruling party, the ANC, and other mass democratic movement organizations. He continues to speak truth to power through his ongoing opinion pieces in a journal that you may well know called the Daily Maverick. His work experience over the last 2 decades has been on strategic management at the ANC headquarters and the South African Qualifications Authority, executive manager in the city of Johannesburg, in the executive mayor's office, and also an independent management consultant in his own company, Kilelo Consulting, working mostly but not exclusively with various government departments. He's also held academic management positions at both the University of Johannesburg and the University of Stellenbosch, respectively. He served as Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Fort Hare until the end of 2022. And he also worked in the capacity as Director of Operations at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections. So those are our two panelists today, our two experts today. So let me turn to Dr. Van Heerden to begin with a short overall scene-setting comments.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Appreciate it, and good day to all the participants. I thought I'd start with the obvious. Obviously, I presume that people understand and know a little about South Africa. Our past is certainly checkered in the sense that we come from a historical injustice, a crime against humanity as declared by the United Nations, apartheid. And so over the last 29 years, South Africa has, of course, since its the advent of democracy in 1994, has been engaged in a transformative project to try and make sure that those needs of the people of South Africa, the majority of the people of South Africa, is met. And of course, as you know, the democracy is hard work. Democracy is hard work, and it conjures up all sorts of challenges. Having said that, I thought I'd kick off very briefly to just illuminate the point about our current domestic situation. And I want to say that as a country, as a democratic constitutional democracy, South Africa has certainly since 1994 dealt with all the big issues. And what I mean with the big issues is that it had put in place an independent judiciary. It had put in place an independent fourth estate in terms of the media. It has put in place institutions under the constitution of the country, under Chapter 9 institutions, independent institutions, a human rights institution, a public protector. There's, of course, also the National Prosecuting Authority, and so on and so forth. And so all the necessary big issues have been dealt with successfully. One other big issue is the fact that the country every 5 years goes to the polls, and the citizens express themselves through a ballot as to who they want as their leaders, as their government, as their party, including local government every 6 years. So those are the big issues. It's in place, it's happening. Of course, in any democracy, there are times when the independence of the judiciary is challenged by civil society, by business, by the legislature itself, and vice versa. But this is all healthy, as you know. This is a healthy democracy, and so there's no eyebrows raised there. Where there is still some work to be done is what I refer to as the small issues. And the small issues is the interpersonal between citizens, between the various race groups within South Africa. That still needs quite a bit of work because, as you can imagine, coming from centuries of colonialism and then, of course, the advent of apartheid, psychologically, racism is still very much prevalent within South African society. It's beginning to get a different view with the younger generation, our children in schools and universities and so forth, but still very much, race is still very much uppermost in the minds of the political psyche and the polity of South Africa. And so that interpersonal between those that must upheld the law and those that transgress the law, the interpersonal between those that educate and those that are students and receive education, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and of course, between government and its citizenry through mass protests and so on and so forth. So the interpersonal remains a huge challenge. But of course, you need to actively work at it to try and resolve. So I think that's important in terms of just sketching. Now, with regards to the topic before us, I wanted to just mention 5 key issues which I think is important as to why South Africa is critical to the continent and to the world. And Marsha touched on a few. The first one I want to indicate is that there is a stable democracy. South Africa is a stable democracy. It's underpinned by a liberal democratic constitution. There's separation of powers. The country's democratic dispensation has been stable since 1994. There's been no mass political upheaval. There's been no military interventions, and so on and so forth. So there's a stable democracy. And I mention this because, as you know, there's a number of hotspots on the continent, governments, countries that are constantly in the realm of war, of conflict, and so on. And so when the outside world look at the continent, there's a few examples of where there is stability over the long term. And of course, those become and is seen as reliable partners. So that's the first critical thing. The second one, as I mentioned, with the big issues, is sound institutions. Despite recent institutional volatility, the legal and political framework for the country's institutions is robust, aimed at engendering dynamic and efficient institutions, buttressed by strong accountability mechanisms. So whether it is the South African Revenue Services, whether it is the National Treasury, South Africa ranks very high on the transparency, budgetary transparency level. Then, of course, thirdly, is the overarching policy imperatives that is underpinned by the Industrial Policy Action Plan. And here it's about trying to make sure that 19 sectors of the economy actually begin to integrate, actually begin to work together. And that gives some modicum of policy certainty, especially to the private sector and foreign investors. And this is over the range of infrastructure, financing, there's technology, competition policy, trade policy. There are certain economic zones that have been identified, and of course, infrastructure. And with regards to infrastructure, I think it's important to also say that the country boasts a developed freight and commuter train rail system, world-class road arterial networks that spans over thousands and thousands of kilometers, state-of-the-art ports and harbors, and of course, internationally competitive technology and connectivity, world-class cities that host large multinational corporations. So these are all, I think, key elements that speaks to why South Africa is seen and viewed as an important and critical partner on the African continent. Perhaps to conclude, there are three major concerns that have been raised by the South African private sector, business leaders and so forth. And I'm sure we will talk about it a little bit more. Those three has been energy. As some of you might know, since 2008, we've had significant challenges with our energy grid within South Africa. And I'm happy to talk about the background and the history and so forth. So energy is one, crime is the second one. Crime is becoming a huge, huge challenge within South Africa. As you know, the highest inequality levels in any country in the world is here in South Africa. And that, of course, gives room for people to want to engage in illicit activities, criminal activities, to try and provide for themselves and their families and so forth. And then finally, the private sector has a big problem with logistics. The very rail, the harbors, the ports that I've spoken about, it needs to be better managed. It needs to be more efficient. And I think the private sector is raising that as a concern. Energy is by far the number one concern. We have smelters in terms of our platinum industry, in terms of our manganese industries, etc., which requires huge amounts of energy. And this is a big, big challenge currently within the South African context. I think, David, let me stop there for now as a way of introductory remarks.
Great. Thanks very much, Oscar. And I think a great set of framings. I'm going to try and build off of them just a little bit here to provide my thoughts on why South Africa continues to be relevant and a critical actor, not only regionally but internationally. And I'm going to try within my remarks to also capture the complexity of that, because I think there's a lot of, it's an easy statement to make that South Africa is a critical actor, but I think there are a lot of there's a lot of nuance associated with what that actually means and what some of the implications are. And I think you've captured it nicely at certain levels. I also just want to acknowledge that we have a number of people on this call who are participants I've seen on the participant list who are keen observers and people, observers of South Africa, who have a lot of knowledge of the country. So I'm really looking forward to our back and forth, Oscar, and then finding a way to engage and bring some of their reflections into this discussion. I understand that Mo Sheikh is actually on the call as well, so it's great to have the High Commissioner here. And of course, at any point, if he wishes to disabuse us of misinformation that we're providing through an official government line, we welcome it, but we'll also take it with a grain of salt, High Commissioner, as we know what role you play, and it's a welcome one. Colleagues, as I think about the broader question, I like to think about South Africa's relevance at three particular levels. The first one really relates to the history of South Africa and the stories that South Africa tells itself about its importance and its resonance, and how domestic narratives of its centrality to the international system, I think, feed into a sense of desire to contribute on the international stage. The second one speaks to a regional significance, and of course, then the third one, I think, speaks to the multilateral, its notion as a multilateral actor. But coming back to that first notion, where we're talking about South Africa's own history, of course, we're 29 years into democracy, and there's a post-apartheid narrative that I think really speaks to a quasi-peaceful transition away from an autocratic regime, from an evil system, from a crime against humanity, as Oscar put it. And I think the notion that South Africa was able to transition out of that space and out of that context in a peaceful way, in a largely peaceful way, I think speaks to a mindset that exists within the country around its importance on the international stage, namely as an exemplar, a moral authority of peace and peaceful transition, and as a society that privileges and premises human rights within its government system. Now, of course, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that did take place in the immediate post context as well, I think that served as an exemplar and a reinforcement of the moral authority narrative that I think continues even to today. We look at other countries such as Canada, even trying to replicate the Truth and Reconciliation type of approach in order to try and deal with its own injustices particularly within Canada, as we've related to treatment of our Indigenous peoples. The South African model continues to be something that people rarefy, that people look at and want to find out more about. And that actually matters, I think, for South Africa in terms of how it relates and how it pitches internationally. Of course, too, when we think about South Africa, we think about critical internationalist actors, Nelson Mandela, O.R. Tambo, Thabo Mbeki, Chris Hani, and even Steve Biko, and dare I say even Jan Smuts still pitch as exemplars, as sort of critical actors when we think about the international system. And they're all held up as internationalists who were committed to rules-based orders and demonstrated South Africa's inherent ability and desire to contribute. And I think that still matters in significant ways internally within South Africa, but also externally when thinking about engaging South Africa in international activity, in regional considerations. But I also think these sorts of pieces feed into a broader sense within South Africa around a deeply held view of South Africa's independence as a nation, its sovereignty, and its ability and capability to make independent foreign policy choices and to motivate and inspire others to follow along. And I think that speaks to a sort of a traditional, or rather not a traditional, but a capacity to invoke a set of considerations, a set of following along, right, that moves beyond the traditional dynamics in terms of who gets to hold power and influence on the international stage. Oscar's made reference to the importance of democratic institutions, and I would say despite the strain that they're currently under in South Africa, they are holding up. And this is actually a unique attribute in the region. And South Africa's ability, I think, to project, I would caveat this by saying, though, that South Africa's ability to project and hold influence around the viability of its democratic institutions is being challenged right at the moment with the change in sort of the positioning and the viewpoint of the African National Congress in the mindset of South Africans. The ANC no longer holds the supermajorities across all levels of government that it once did. And, with that sort of change, a declining support in the ANC, due to corruption and due to problems associated with service delivery, we see a change in its ability to project a sort of consistent or a consistent position and approach to the international, be it regionally or even internationally. Of course, we see exceptions within the state around the democratic institutions. The judiciary is really the last bastion, I would say, of formal democratic institutions that is still strong. We've seen a significant weakening of democratic legislatures at all levels of government, including even at the national. Oscar's mentioned the infrastructure and the decline of that, and the power generation ability, and the ability of South Africa to project influence through its provider, its ability to have stable energy internally, but also to provide for the region, and that does have problems. But of course, we should also remember here too that civil society plays a really important role in terms of holding on to those democratic spaces. And of course, South African civil society is small, decentralized, but it's actually quite effective and powerful. If I can shift now to the level 2 and thinking about the regional significance, South Africa continues to pitch regionally on the continent. The African Union, South Africa is a net contributor to the African Union financially through its tax arrangements. South Africa is one of a few countries on the continent that actually collects taxes locally to then send to the African Union as a means of financially supporting that organization. And that, I think, increases its prominence and relevance within the broader continental decision-making structures. South African Customs Union is the oldest customs union in the world. And South Africa plays a critical and administrative role in supporting and shoring up countries around it, namely Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and Eswatini. I don't want to diminish, I don't want to overstate the function of that, but I also don't want to diminish it. South Africa's influence within the SADC region as a result of SACU is really quite important. We shouldn't forget that. Of course, some commentators in the past have called South Africa a regional hegemon as it relates to SADC and its regional economic community. I think that type of narrative is less relevant now, particularly as we see South Africa struggling to find other ways to project influence and power, particularly through its military and security, peace and security initiatives. The South African Defense Forces are in trouble. They are suffering under constant cuts, and their ability to mobilize and to be involved in peacekeeping missions across the continent is significantly diminished. And of course, the traditional avenue of arms production and support and projecting power through the ability to provide arms through the Denel Corporation, well, Denel is virtually bankrupt and is really not being an effective organization anymore. Allow me just to shift to level 3 before I turn us to our discussion mode. Thinking here about, in particular, South Africa as an international actor. It's for many years has been considered an emerging middle power, engaged in multilateralism, believes in the international order, but is actually also agitating and trying to foster change. So South Africa has always played, or I shouldn't say always, but at least in the post-apartheid context, has sought to play a role of one that moves with the international order, but seeks to change it to try and make it more fair and more just. It's the only African member of the G20. It's the only African member of the BRICS alliance. And it appears that, there's a real priority associated with BRICS, which feels to, observers here in Canada and in North America, the traditional G7 spaces, the traditional Commonwealth spaces, as a big shift. Some commentators argue that this is actually about fostering that international order change, and that this is about South Africa maintaining some degree of foreign policy independence, not necessarily about signifying a solidarity with the BRICS members in that sort of traditional alliance sense, but actually more about seeing BRICS as a probable and possible way of doing things differently on the international stage. So as I wrap it up, I'd like to, perhaps pose the first question to Oscar as it relates to South Africa in the international order. And let's just jump in to this idea of South Africa and the BRICS, and in particular, South Africa's position on Russia. Oscar, you're well aware of some of the dynamics behind the scenes, given your role as a commentator and observer, but also within the ANC party. What's with aligning with Russia in this moment?
Well, thanks for that, David. The thing is that the problem with this whole issue about Russia, Ukraine is that most people are seeing it as a binary. It's either with or against. It's either you choose, you must condemn or not. And I think that is precisely the problem. This is not about siding with Russia. I think you've put it so eloquently. For South Africa, it's about foreign policy consistency. You would recall as way back as the early days of our democracy, when South Africa, was involved in trying to foster some form of peace with the DRC. And again, the Americans wanted to push it in a particular direction, and Mandela made it very clear that he's the captain of his own ship. He is engaged in talks, and we're going to do it in a particular way that we think is best for the continent, for the region, and so forth. So I'm raising that as an example to illustrate that it has been the consistent pattern of South Africa to try and exert that foreign policy independence, but also coupled with that is indeed the issue around non-alignment. Apologies. Non-alignment. As you know, coming out of the Cold War, again, we found ourselves in a world that was very binary, black and white. You are either with the communists or you are with the capitalists. Again, South Africa and indeed Canada chose to walk a slightly different path in the sense that it was not helpful for anyone to want to have this binary approach to how we do international relations. And so with the Russia-Ukraine issue, and I think it's important to say, David, that firstly, there exists narratives that are clashing with each other. And I think it's important that that if you talk to the South African government, if you talk to many of the South Africans that are in the policy space, they subscribe to a particular narrative. And that narrative goes back to 2008 with the Bucharest Conference of NATO, the declaration of Georgia and Ukraine becoming part of NATO. Then, of course, there's the 2014 coup, in which evidence suggests that the US had a hand in it, and so on and so forth. That's one narrative. Of course, the other narrative is simply that this is supposedly one country that invaded another sovereign country. And that country is the aggressor and is ruled by a madman, and so on and so forth. So these are the competing narratives that are playing out in South Africa as well. I dare say it's not as if there is one common position. From a South African government point of view, it's about that policy certainty, it's about that policy independence, and it is about non-alignment. And I think that in as much as some people and some pundits have been saying that, you know, in this day and age, how can you be non-aligned? I think South Africa is trying to make a very clear point, particularly because of multilateralism, that there is very much still room for non-alignment, and that if you want to be an honest broker in these sorts of conflicts and war, then you need to keep your nose clean and not necessarily take sides in wanting to come out quick to condemn and so on and so forth. That said, I think that there's a lot of people that, of course, talk about the fact that South Africa has these historic ties with Russia. And of course, that's true. But I think it is, the general view is that it is slightly patronizing to suggest that South Africa is only taking this position because of some historic ties. You know, we are, as you've indicated, a player within the international system. We've always been active in multilateralism, and we have very strong views about that system and how it should change and transform and so forth. You would recall, David, and this is my last point, that South Africa under the Mbeki administration started out with an alliance which included India and Brazil. And some might argue that was a good alliance, it was a good grouping because, you know, all three countries were subscribing to Western democracy and Western democratic principles. But of course, South Africa was invited into BRICS, which then had two additional members, which is China and Russia. Needless to say, China is one of our second largest, it's our second largest trading partner. Russia, not so much. You know, and Russia is a small trading partner. Of course, now with the sanctions and so forth, there's been renewed interest in wanting to expand that trade relations between the two countries. But I just wanted to make the point that it is indeed about foreign policy independence. It's about a conventional practice that has been there from the early days of our democracy. And of course, also having learned from the bad old days of the Cold War. When you take a side, you can seriously get burned.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting set of reflections. And I mean, I certainly, you know, I always try to diminish the idea that history and historical relations matter much in these sorts of circumstances, right? I mean, you can have kinship, you can have, connection, camaraderie, what have you, but, at the end of the day, as in independent and sovereign nations, self-interest tends to sort of be the guiding force. But in light of that, right? I mean, I still struggle to understand the choice of, in this moment in particular, to engage in military maneuvers with the Russians at the same time as South Africa claiming non-alignment. If you're not aligned, right, you don't choose in the exact moment when an aggressor is invading another country to engage in military maneuvers. If you're not aligned, then the idea of abstaining or rather condemning particular acts of aggression hold a different sort of level of import. And we're seeing, South Africa making the choice, as Russia takes its action and invades Ukraine, to do military maneuvers, not doing it with anybody else. At the same time, at the United Nations General Assembly, as a non-aligned country, as an independent sovereign nation, choosing quite actively to abstain from votes condemning Russia's behavior. One of a few, right? We're talking like a handful, less than 12 other countries followed suit with South Africa. I'm just curious about how much this non-alignment actually holds sway. And it doesn't make any sense to me, right? Because I look at the trade numbers. Russia doesn't pitch. I look at the sort of political influence of Russia on the international stage beyond the BRICS. It's a toxic political actor internationally. I don't see how it advances South Africa's interests. So I don't know if you had any more insight into the decision around, or rather this sort of conflict between the notion of non-alignment and what is actually happening in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, firstly, it's not entirely correct to say that we've not done military practices with others. Just a few months earlier, we were engaged in military exercises with the United States, and if you go a little bit prior to that, with the United Kingdom. So, and it's part of that, again, I come back to the non-alignment issue. It's we are not going to necessarily stop these military exercises with one, but we do it with others. So that's the first thing. Also, these things have been, as you know, these plans are agreed upon well in advance. No one had anticipated a conflict in Europe that would last more than a year. And so it just so happened that it coincided as the conflict celebrates, well, if the word is celebrate, enters its first year of conflict. But I think the issue, to quite honestly, David, the answer I think lies in exactly what you said earlier in your opening remarks, which is that South Africa is indeed, as an active participant in the international system, seeing and making choices about how that system has to change. The current status quo within the international system, South Africa has consistently, since its advent of democracy, wanting to argue that there is need for change, that a post-World War II configuration is not working for the global South, that there needs to be more people at the table of the UN Security Council, that the Bretton Woods institutions in its current form needs to change in terms of its emphasis, in terms of who can be the president and or chairperson, and so on and so forth. Because these things were designed at a time when the victors of World War II decided how they would divvy up the geostrategic world as they see it. And so South Africa has been consistently arguing that there is need for change. And the truth of the matter is that this particular conflict has brought those issues front and center. And so South Africa is then in that situation of saying, do we now backpedal on something that we know needs to happen, or do we stay the course and double down? And I think South Africa, for the moment, have decided to double down. Of course, that comes with consequences. I don't think the South Africans are are ignorant about that reality. It comes with consequences, and the way the West, the collective West, is viewing this conflict, this war, and how they are responding to those that might be seen to be friendly with Russia, it gets a very bleak future. You know, as far as I'm concerned, as a scholar of international relations, through my writings, I'm already trying to prepare the South Africans and the South African government for very harsh decisions on the part of the United States. They are going to exclude us from AGOA, and they are going to begin to impose, if needs be, soft sanctions on South Africa, because, in my view, we are dealing with a declining empire, and the last kicks is going to be deadly. You know, they're not going to give us any room to talk about diplomacy. And so it's going to be a difficult, dark clouds are gathering, as they say.
Not to be ominous or anything. But, you know, I mean, I think this leads into that's sort of a nice segue into this idea of South Africa as a change agent on the international stage. And, you know, from my vantage point, seeing South Africa prioritizing different institutions at a conceptual level makes a lot of sense. But at a pragmatic level, given its own domestic condition, namely the level of unemployment, the level of inequality that you mentioned, obviously the crime levels that are connected to the inequality, you know, clear ways to address this is through, you know, fostering an investment environment where jobs are created, and where, you know, new monies are coming into the country that sort of feed into the possibilities and hopes. You know, at a basic level, it's about jobs. But South Africa seems to be, in many respects, on the international stage, thumbing its nose or poking the eyes of those who have traditionally given that space to South Africa, namely the United States. Less extent the EU, but still there's some aggravations there. Why in this particular moment is this the right strategy or why is this not the right strategy, but why is this the strategy of South Africa, you know, just at the time when it actually could use some more money or could use staying in AGOA, for example, and I'm glad you brought that up. Why is it trying to sort of thumb its nose or poke its finger in the eye of a country that helps? And quotation mark, help.
Yeah. Look, I mean, obviously all trade is two-way. I mean, obviously, but look, I think my thinking around it, David, would be that in many ways, 29 years into our democracy, perhaps these partners that you're referring to could have done much more to try and assist us in the developmental agenda, you know, in a very short space of time. And this is where I think some Western scholars are missing the point. In a very short space of time, China has made immense impact, physically and otherwise, on the African continent. You know, and the truth of the matter is you have Africans that are saying, you know, we've been in bed with the United States, with the European Union for decades. And the kind of Belt and Road initiatives that is actually rolling out all over the continent is a far cry of what we got from those partners, you know. And so I think that it's not so much, you know, South Africa has always tried to maintain healthy relations with the collective West. As you've indicated, you know, a huge trading bloc is the European Union. Of course, huge amounts of investment through, I think the last figure was 600 companies from the United States, and so on. And so I am of the opinion that when it comes to the crunch point, the United States will have to reflect very deeply on the kind of action or the kind of sanction they would want to impose on a democratic country like South Africa, because I think it's going to speak volumes with regards to the world and how countries that are smaller, more dependent, etc., is going to view that kind of action. And I think, you know, Senator Lindsey Graham's piece of legislation. I don't think it's going to see the light of day. I don't think Congress is going to approve it, but you never know.
And just for observers here, Lindsey Graham's legislation is what?
Well, he has put a piece of legislation together saying we are a bit too friendly with the Russians and with the Chinese, and therefore there needs to be punitive actions against South Africa in more ways than one. Basically saying we need to, teach South Africa a lesson. There should be soft sanctions and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm putting it in a nutshell, but basically that is what he's proposing. I don't think it's going to necessarily see the light of day. I think the Black Caucus will take issue with it and so forth. We have a delegation currently in the United States from South Africa trying to soften matters and tension that's there and wanting to make the Americans understand why South Africa is taking the kind of position that it is taking. And so it's a difficult one, David, and I'm sure you've also been grappling with it within your classrooms, which is that what do you do in a situation where there's a rising power, China, there's a declining power, the United States, there is, for example, the issue of the importance of the dollar, and the fact that more and more countries are beginning to say, actually, this dollar has been holding sway over us to the advantage of the United States for decades. Perhaps there is some room to change that so that we have a bit more say, a bit more participation, and that so that there isn't just this sort of cane that is being used to whip us into line every time the United States wants a particular outcome. So I think these are sort of all in the pot with Department of International Relations and Cooperation and the South African government. What do we do in a situation where we are now part of BRICS, and we take the alliance serious, of course. There's a BRICS summit coming in August of this year, and the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Putin. And again, it has caused a huge amount of debate and arguments within the polity in South Africa. But I think that, to answer your question about poking, perhaps the South African government, rightly or wrongly, is saying that there's never a right time for a particular change within the international system. And I said this to some people in certain chat groups and so forth, when they were talking about, the sanctions and the arrest warrant. And I said, it's not so much about whether we're going to arrest Putin or not. That's actually inconsequential. The issue is, are we going to be bullied into having to make certain foreign policy choices? Because if that be the case, then it means every other decision. If America tomorrow decides we, as Senator Graham says, we are too friendly with China and we need to impose sanctions on China and we must not allow their companies in South Africa, are we then also going to be forced to do that? And I think that, from an international relations point of view, is where the difficulty lies.
Yeah, I mean, I think I take those points seriously. The interesting piece here is it's a little bit of a game of chicken with the United States around the AGOA piece, right? It's actually not within the US's interests to sanction and to marginalize South Africa any more than it currently is, right? I mean, otherwise it's just going to push South Africa more into the arms of China, Russia, and the BRICS alliance. And there's an interesting little game that's afoot here. You look at what's happened to Russia since the global sanctions have been imposed upon them. Well, their economy has been hit marginally, but they've completely reoriented and integrated with China. Would such a circumstance also happen in a situation where, say, the United States cut South Africa off in a similar manner? Would South Africa pivot more strongly and coherently with China? And I think that's a risk that the Americans need to reflect really carefully on, because obviously that would diminish their influence in the region, because South Africa has been a partner on that score. But I just want to shift. There's an interesting point you raise here about the ICC, and obviously there's been quite a bit of fracas lately with Ramaphosa's misspeak as it turned out the other day when the Finnish president was visiting, around withdrawing from the ICC. But, commentators and people concerned like me jumped on it because this has been something that's not, that this has been something that's been going on for a while. The idea of South Africa's relationship with the ICC being contested. You've got a very strong opinion that South Africa should be imagining itself outside of the ICC framework. And then on that score, I imagine to the invariable question, will South Africa arrest Putin? You would argue no. I suspect I would argue no as well, and I would be curious about whether or not those are different reasons. But what's your take on the ICC and South Africa's future with it?
Yeah, no, I mean, just for those that are listening, my view is that we must withdraw from the ICC. It is seen as a court of last resort. Our courts and our judicial system in South Africa is very strong. And if, God forbid, there should be heinous crimes and war crimes and mass human rights violations, I think, like the TRC process, we've proven that we will be able to domestically manage those processes. But that's an aside. I think that the ICC was not on the radar of South Africans for a very long time until 2012, when al-Bashir came and was invited by President Zuma's administration to come to an African AU leaders conference. And that's when suddenly it was front and center. And of course, there, what happened was that one of the NGOs in South Africa took the matter to court, and the South African courts ruled that indeed the South African government are obliged by international law to arrest Bashir. By the time the ruling was made, Bashir was already on a plane flying back to Sudan, facilitated, of course, in no small measure by the South African government, because they simply didn't want to arrest him. Now, in my question that I ask anyone who says, will South Africa arrest Putin, is if Putin decides to go to Canada tomorrow, let's say, assuming that it's facilitating peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, will Canada arrest Putin? For that matter, if he goes to the White House, will America arrest Putin? They will not. So why do everyone expects South Africa to arrest Putin? It's not going to happen. I mean, I don't think he'll come. Firstly, he wouldn't want to put one of his allies and partners into that sort of difficult position, unless, of course, South Africa gives enormous guarantees that nothing will happen if indeed he does come. What's currently happening, David, is you have your domestic law, and you have the Rome Statute. And the way the two integrate and speak to each other, I'm made to understand, is through an implementation act. So a piece of legislation is drafted to make sure that your local laws and legislation fits in neatly with the Rome Statute. Now, what some members of the ICC has done is to have a slight amendment in the Implementation Act that excludes heads of states. So all will apply, but not the arrest of a head of state, because that's tantamount to a declaration of war, and therefore we don't want to necessarily declare war on others. And so they've excluded that. And I think what's currently happening is that some of the legislatures here in South Africa is looking at that piece of legislation and whether they can push it through Parliament and get it approved before August, instead of wanting to wholesale withdraw from the ICC, because that process is just very long and tedious and it takes many years. So that's currently the status. I think the ruling party then in 2017, took a decision that we must withdraw, because they've come to appreciate, because of the Bashir issue, they see the court, and this is a bit of a problematic argument, but they see the court as an extension almost of the international institutions that we've spoken about, whether it's WTO, whether it's the IMF and the World Bank, the ICC is yet just another extension of that. It's not necessarily correct to see it as such, but that's what the view is. And therefore, when you have an ICC that has predominantly prosecuted African leaders, with the exception of Milosevic, and have in front of them, through credible independent verifications, war crimes on the part of the Israeli government, gross abuses and violations on the part of American soldiers in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And supposedly the court takes years to try and investigate, get to the bottom of it, and to pull, if at all, an indictment and an arrest warrant together. What we see here is a court that is so efficient that within a space of 12 months, it is able to pull such an indictment together and actually issue the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. And it just smacks of certain biases that is unfortunate. And I think that is sort of the predominant narrative within the South African context.
Yeah, I mean, again, relevant points about sort of what would US or Canada do. And I think, the legality of all this, right, is really clear. Putin's been charged under the legal framework. It's, required, states are incumbent upon themselves to arrest Putin if he sets foot on their soil. But there's the politics that come into this as well. And, arresting Putin, who's head of a nuclear power, does come with significant implications, and one has to be ready for what that range of implications would be. And this is not somebody who is a reasonable actor, right? He's left us with the impression that hitting the nuclear button is something that he's willing to do, and that we have to take very seriously. So I take that to heart. One of the things though that I think is getting wrapped up in this ICC debate in particular is the ANC and its sort of moral authority as a ruling party. ANC is quite remarkable, right? It's been in power since for 29 years. That's remarkable in the sense of there aren't not many other democratic systems and states that have that as an experience. How much do you think that the internal challenges of the ANC, its moral authority, the corruption and the nepotism, I think that are that sort of exists, that's been shown through the State Capture Commission, how much of this is impacting South Africa's ability to rebuff some of the more, I think, expected critiques and chart that independence, that sovereign position as a foreign policy, as an international actor?
I mean, you're right. It's been, for all intents and purposes, a one-party state for a very long time. There are, of course, sizable opposition parties, but they don't come anywhere close to the kind of support, even with the declining support of the ANC. Standing currently at 57% of the electorate, as opposed to 23% by the nearest and biggest opposition party. So that does speaks, that has its implications on its own. But the argument I would imagine that the ANC people will put to the fore is that, if you don't want the ANC to give certain policy directives through its, 5-yearly conference and so forth, then they need to be put out. This is the democratic process. And I think the ANC is looking through the lens of, as the governing party, this is the kind of things that we get involved in and we need to pronounce on. And as you know, David, once they've made a resolution, they actually execute. An example of that is that the ANC conference decided to downgrade its embassy in Israel to try and sort of register its protests at the handling of the Palestinian issue. And indeed that happened. It was executed. And of course, there were opposition parties that were against that decision and so on and so forth. But I would imagine the ANC takes these decisions because it thinks that it's in the best interest of the country.
Yeah. Are you done with your thought, or? Yeah.
So sorry, I've got a catch in my throat. So for the ANC, it's rather, as I say, the discussions within the conference was centered around this reality of a changing global order, the mismanagement of a rules-based international order, and the institutions, global institutions that are no longer fit for purpose. And yet there's no interest in wanting to look at it and reconfigure it and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very sticky situation in, and I don't think anyone knows where exactly it's going to go.
You know, you and I have chatted in the past about the importance at some point of the tripartite alliance dissolving. You know, the ANC government has existed because of its alliance with the communists, but also with COSATU, the trade union. And that for many years worked to offer stability in a time when it was needed, when the international community needed to see stability, but also internally, right, to show unity across the country for the private sector, but also even just for society, right, for the different groups to realize that there was opportunity to heal. You know, more and more, I think as we sort of come up to that 30th anniversary, I keep reflecting on the need for that tripartite alliance to actually end up dissolving, and to think about and imagine the possibility of an ANC, of a Communist Party, of a COSATU group, plus the Democratic Alliance, you know, perhaps the EFF, if it can shed its fascist tendencies, actually engaging in a deep contestation, a multi-party contestation. I know that there were fissures a few years ago that brought it really close to dissolution, but they seem to have pulled it back. From your vantage point, as an observer, as somebody who works within the party, what's the likelihood of that happening?
Well, the fissures are back. The Communist Party is having they've in fact taken a decision that they should contest next year's general election as an independent party. To the great consternation and chagrin of the ANC. And of course, there are problems with COSATU. And that's just, you know, from the time of the 2008-9 financial crisis, which we never really fully recovered from, plus the introduction of COVID that has really hit the sector in a very bad way. And the ANC having taken certain policy decisions that COSATU didn't necessarily agree with. All of this as a combination has put downward pressure on the tripartite alliance, and it's I think it would be wrong for me to say that it's in a healthy state. It is not.
Okay, so stay tuned then, I guess.
Yep.
Well, I'm just noticing the time. It's just after 1. We have until 1:30. Marcia, I wanted to turn it back to you to see if there are folks within the participant group that perhaps wanted to pose some questions. You're the moderator, so I leave that to you.
Thank you. If you can hear me, one of the commentators or one of the participants put in a question which was very much aligned with what you've been talking about, but a little bit more sharply. It had to do with the fact, or the question is, to what extent does the admiration by many ANC members of the relative success economically, especially China, and politically, of one-party states such as China and Russia explain the support of South Africa for Russia? Whichever of you wants to deal with that one.
Yeah, well, why don't I start off? I mean, you know, I think, again, it comes back to, I like to contextualize the historical piece, right? I mean, I think, you know, Russia, the Soviet Union rather, played a very important role in the anti-apartheid movement, as well as you well understand, Gaston, given your own understandings and experiences in South Africa. But I think, you know, Russia is a different entity. and the Russian state, in particular the Russian government, is entirely different. I think that, you know, the admiration dimension, I'm not sure how far it extends. You know, there are relationships between the states, right, between South Africa and Russia, but that has been fairly limited. We see a very limited role for Russia in terms of the imagination, within the imagination of South Africa. Trade is insignificant. We're not seeing many Russian institutions that are either fostering a degree of propaganda or extolling the benefits of the relationship. We don't see that investment, so we don't see many Russian companies, at least in a comparative sense to EU companies or American companies, or dare I say even Chinese companies, that pitch up and hit in the imagination of South Africa. So I would suggest that in actual fact, I'm not sure it's that admiration piece. I'm not sure if it's driven at all by the economics or even the historical dimension. I think it's largely driven by South Africa's desire to fundamentally reshape the international order and seeing BRICS as a vessel to do that, and being aligned then in that true sense with Brazil, Russia, India, and China in that mission. And so in many respects, offering an element of solidarity on that score for that reason, not anything more. I don't know, Oscar, what do you think?
No, well, first, I would agree with the objective. I think you're absolutely right. I think South Africa is doing what it's doing because it fundamentally believes that the international system needs to be reshaped. It's not so much about this unquestioning admiration for Russia, not at all. I do think that, you know, I think we make a mistake when we want to package China and Russia together, you know, besides the alliance, of course, in BRICS. But I do think that South Africa, you would find, has a completely different view and take on China and its relationship with China. I do also think that the point you're making about BRICS is correct, that, you know, what is the point in wanting to be in an alliance when at the drop of a hat you are going to not necessarily defend that alliance, act in a particular manner that is in keeping with being in an alliance. You know, the converse would be the European Union, or the converse would be NATO, for that matter. Imagine if one of the members are pulling in a different direction every time it comes to a particular issue. So I think that South Africa is wanting to demonstrate the importance of BRICS as an alliance. And it is part of a project that is wanting to fundamentally change the current global system.
There's a question that's sort of come into the chat. Marcia, do you want me to read that out, or do you want to do it?
I was just going to put the context a little bit because I saw the same question. This has more to do with the issue of South Africa's role within Africa, and in particular its relationship with the African Union. And Ian Ferguson has said, how does the South African government square that it's offside with the majority of AU members on the war in Ukraine, including the most democratic? In the last UNGA vote, he tallied that there were 31 voted yes and 2 voted no, 5 did not vote, and 15 abstained, including South Africa. What happened to African unity?
Well, I mean, you know, again, a very good question, of which, you know, leaves me uncertain in large part because, I mean, the South African government position is even offside with its own population. If you look at opinion polls across South Africa, there is, you know, a clear support for Ukraine over Russia and a clear dismay over why the government continues to, quote unquote, take a non-aligned position and refuse to criticize the Russian government. I harken back to a recent article where Mo Sheikh, High Commissioner to Canada, was interviewed by the Ottawa Citizen. And, you know, I think he sought to contextualize the South African government position more along the lines of it that it wasn't supporting Russia, but that it didn't see the pathway forward as an explicit critique as being an overly helpful one, and was still holding on to a broader desire at some point to play a brokering role, which might explain why it's seemingly out of sync. Now, let's not overstate that out of syncness. It's abstaining. And, there are some commentators out there, and I'd probably include myself in that would argue that an abstention is a vote of support. But, there is a legitimate viewpoint here and perhaps a calculation within the government that if it wants to play a brokering role, it can't be seen as explicitly on one side over the other.
Yeah, I mean, my comment would be that, the African unity issue is contentious to the extent that, if already South Africa is engaging from a policy point of view of discussions of potential consequence management from what the United States could or would potentially do, imagine what other economies on the continent is going through. We know, for example, that when there are certain votes that must be had in the General Assembly, African countries are cajoled, are actually told, if not then, and so on and so forth. It's simply not a clear-cut issue of so many countries being against Russia. I don't think, because obviously it's not in keeping with a non-aligned argument, David, I don't think an abstention is necessarily a support. I think that argument suggests precisely a binary look at these situations. You are either with us or against us. And I find it curious. I mean, I throw it back to you. Where is this non-aligned tradition of the Canadians on this issue? I see an about turn, for example, slowly, but it's happening on the whole issue. People are saying they are pro one China, but evidently they are not through their actions and so on and so forth. And I know that it's a concern of what's happening with China and Taiwan, obviously. And that once the Ukraine matter is out of the way, I would imagine that's going to become front and center.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, where this sort of abstention lies more as a vote of support is when you combine it with some of the other actions. And I come back to the first question that we started off with, which was, why did South Africa choose to engage in military maneuvers with Russia at this particular point, at that particular moment? And so, I would argue that a non-aligned position would hold more weight, and an abstention role would hold more weight as soon, in a condition where there wasn't these sort of outward gestures of connection, right? Of alignment. We know that countries don't just engage in military maneuvers with each other at a whim. There has to be an agreement about information sharing, systems sharing, which are confidential, which are generally classified and secret. So the indication that South Africa was willing to do that with Russia at this particular moment, I think sort of feeds into my skepticism around what the abstentions actually mean. But you're right. International affairs is inherently inconsistent, and I mean, Canada. I'm not sure how much Canada aligns with a non-aligned position now, as opposed to, say, maybe 15 years ago. I kind of feel like we've left that down the road. And maybe this is, the Western response is a response to feeling uncomfortable with not claiming a space, excuse me. But this leads into, I think...
David, if I could just jump in for 1 second.
Sorry, yeah, Marsha, go ahead. Yeah.
The South African ambassador wanted to address the group and come in at this point. And so if you're comfortable with that, I will put him on now. Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
Go for it, Mo.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oscar and David and Marsha, what a fascinating discussion. This is indeed, I mean, I just love the way you'll do it so calmly. And I was wondering, whether I would be able to be so calm on these matters, but incredibly insightful, very balanced, and I'm very impressed at the nature of this discussion. So thank you, Oscar, and thank you, David, so much for that. I think there is one other area in which, to answer the topic of the question in regard to why South Africa matters on the continent, because I think we are in South Africa, and Oscar may agree with me and add more emphasis on it, that we are in the throes of what I would call a polycrisis of a special type, where the various fault lines in our country are starting to intersect. And the way we would be able to solve this, if we would be able to solve it, will be like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, our own negotiation process, etc., would be learnings for the rest of the world in regard to how to manage polycrises, because polycrises is onto us. Even if we just take where we are in Canada, the notion of inequality in Canada is rising. Yes, it has been managed by a particular approach of the government, but that means the budget deficit is rising. Social cohesion is breaking down in Canada, like it is breaking down in South Africa. Climate change is going to affect Canada significantly, as it is already affecting South Africa. And you can go through all the various fault lines. And I think because of our particular history in South Africa, where our fundamental contradictions of inequality, underdevelopment, poverty is now being pushed to the fore as the world is changing, not only in multipolarity, but changing in the very nature of the mode of production itself. And it is those changes in the mode of production, of financial capitalization. And David, you would know, I have spoken previously about what I call the Canadian Tire economics of Canada, which is all dependent on supply chains coming out of Asia, and in particular coming out of China. And the mood in Canada is increasingly becoming anti-China. And I think we need to factor in the Canadian dialogue one other political party, and forgive me, and we'll work on the basis of Chatham House rules here, that the other political party that is merging in Canada is called CSIS. And the way CSIS is releasing reports and is starting to influence the direction of political discourse in Canada is something to be taken note of, where a state actor now starts to shape the political direction of a country. We have seen, and we have had elements of that in South Africa. So I'm just making the point, and I hope I did so calmly, that the one other very important lesson that we can take from South Africa, because of sequencing and timing, it is going to have to deal with the complexity science of polycrises. And the way South Africa manages that could provide early lessons to the rest of the world, and in particular other countries who may want to take an interest on how to learn from the management of polycrises. I thought I'll make that point. Marcia, thank you so much for letting me in. You can mute me if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We very much appreciate your commentary, thoughtful as usual. And I'm going to turn back to Oscar and David to see if they have some responses to it, give you a chance to weigh in on the important issue of polycrisis.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in first because I mean, I think, you know, it's certainly an idea that it resonates with me, and I want to just reflect on a chapter that David Black and I wrote for the South African Foreign Policy Review recently. It was volume 4, just released, where we essentially were talking about the possibilities for Canada and South Africa as effectively middle powers in a changing international order and dealing with the similar types of pressures as the High Commissioner noted, but in different scales and in different contextual realities that I think, mean and result in different actions. And I think what we're seeing, though, is that this polycrisis moment is a huge threat to the multilateral order, at least as we've known it, right? Multilateralism in a sense of, as an exemplar of pluralism. I actually think that we're seeing spaces like Canada, but also spaces like South Africa, turning far more inward and being less interested in engaging with difference in terms of political views and wanting to seek to align more with traditional allies or friends as have been normally understood. And I think that's going to have a significant impact, I think, around how we deal with these crises, but it's also going to, as the High Commissioner pointed out, have a really significant economic implication as things get reoriented. Canada will likely rely less on China for manufactured goods, and will look to other spaces, that it considers allies, this notion of ally shoring.
Oscar, did you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Marsha. I mean, for me, in terms of conclusionary remarks, I want to emphasize multilateralism. South Africa as a country is wanting to move away from a unipolar world to a multilateral world. Liberal internationalism is what they are promoting, wanting to remain active players within the international system, but a reconfigured system. A world where we simply don't see things in binaries. The Western liberal democracy has had a good innings, and it still has a role to play worldwide. But there are now emerging powers, such as China, that is beginning to come with a different narrative that is not subscribing to a Western democratic framework. And I think that instead of seeing that as an enemy, we need to engage in how we can strategically engage with China and others, such as China. And then finally, no one is even remotely talking about, from the collective West, of a possibility of engaging with the global South to begin to address the very concerns around reconfiguring of the international governance system, starting from the UN, including the Bretton Woods institutions and so forth. That leadership is simply missing in the equation. And so I fear that if that is just going to fall on deaf ears, it is going to mean that more and more countries are going to begin looking east in terms of their future. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So one final question. I know we have very few minutes left, and there are many questions in the talk, but I'm going to go back to one that I introduced early on and just try to bring it in to the multilateral piece of this question. And that is the Eskom crisis for South Africa is obviously a crisis for the economy and the region, but it's also a crisis hitting a stage where South Africa, as a member of the international community, is going to have to move towards a transition away from traditional kinds of energy and into alternative energies. And it's an area where you can imagine international investment and creativity and so on is going to be really essential for that transition. So here I'm just trying to probe into this issue when we're looking at South Africa's role in the region and how will it play in this area of environmental concern?
Yeah. Well, so Marsha, I mean, what the South African government has done is to exactly, in a way, take that middle road yet again. I don't want to say non-aligned, but that middle road, which is that it agreed it will have a mixed energy plan. Mm-hmm. What that really means is that there is space for all of these component parts. There's a massive increase because of the current crisis. There's a massive increase with alternative energy. More allowance and more grid space has been created through legislation. There's been various bid windows. And in the very near future, because as you know, it takes a bit of time for those to come online, those wind and solar energy. That has now come to a point where we think as we go into 2024, a lot of that will come on stream and decrease the pressure on the grid. That's the first thing. And of course, as we move in this transition, that will grow and grow and grow. So there's no push against moving with the just transition in terms of renewables. What is the debate is saying in South Africa is with our huge deposits of coal, it just makes sense that we have to wean ourselves off it in a much slower pace, because it is such a huge sector. It is such a huge contributor to the GDP, and it employs such large numbers that a rush to an alternative is simply going to disrupt and be too disruptive. And so, of course, the other last point I want to make is, even though there's a very strong lobby against nuclear, the truth of the matter is that the South African government has kept it on the agenda as part of that mixed energy plan. And I would imagine that once we stabilize the grid, there's going to be talk of building 1 or 2 more nuclear power facilities.
David.
Yeah, I mean, the irony of the moment, right, is that the challenges of power production in South Africa are actually accelerating its green transition, namely, people taking up and looking to produce their own electricity through solar panels, but also windmill, and you've seen the proliferation of panels on people's roofs and little windmills attached to chimneys. I think this is being seen now as a significant response, and this is a remarkable change, because not even 2 years ago, Eskom and the South African government were actually looking to impose greater tariffs on those installing solar panels and the like, because they were going to be contributing to the grid, and they wanted to find some source of revenue from that. They've now completely reversed that and are looking to incentivize that process. So I think, I agree with Oscar on that point. The solution, that solution still, though, is very costly at an individual level. Solar panel prices and the batteries, the inverters that are being utilized now are very expensive due to the sort of demand. So there's going to have to be some consideration, especially given the levels of inequality and poverty in South Africa, of how that's going to be rolled out in a more broad way, in a way that's accessible to the majority of the population. I think I agree with Oscar on the point about nuclear as well, that it's still on the table, but I will say it's a remarkably expensive proposition, and likely would be from a rollout perspective take the same amount of time as it would to fix some of the generation capacity, the coal generation capacity of Medupe and Katsile generation stations. It'll take about 10 to 15 years to really bring a nuclear power plant online, plus billions of dollars. That's the projection too for fixing the power generation capacity within South Africa's coal sites. So I think there's going to have to be an explicit social choice made on that score. But in the interim, we're seeing this as a positive force for that green energy transition.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the last minute of the webinar. We have a whole range of other questions, so I guess we're going to have to invite you guys back another time, because we do have quite a number of people who are interested and appreciative of your comments, your thoughtfulness, and your provocative comments. I want to thank you very much for participating today, and I'm going to turn back to Sheikh Bangura for a formal thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. As always, your deep and profound knowledge of African issues makes you an excellent moderator of discussions on African issues. We are lucky today that the internet connection was perfect from Africa, and that was not the case last week. And I would like especially to thank Ambassador Sheikh for his presence and his contribution to this debate. On behalf of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council, I would like to thank our speakers, panelists, for their excellent conversation. Dr. David Hornsby, professor at the Norman Paterson School and Associate Vice President of Carleton University, and Dr. Oscar van Heerden, a well-known South African commentator on current events who has an academic background in international political economy with an emphasis on Africa and SADC in particular. Thank you so much to both of you. I would like to thank our colleagues, Mafoya Lusumon, Communication Director of Africa Study Group, and valuable resource person within the Secretariat of African Study Group, as well as Denis Lombardo and Liliane Leblanc from the CIC National Capital Branch for all the communication support that went into organizing this event, this session. Let me also take this opportunity to inform our members and friends that we have received many calls for a session on Sudan. As always, we have heard your call and are working on it with our partners. And meanwhile, we praise Canada's tremendous effort for a rapid resolution of the ongoing conflict in Sudan, and Minister Jolie's recent visit to Kenya, as well as our country's Canada humanitarian assistance to Sudan and the neighboring countries that happened in the last 10 days. Please note that this session has been recorded and will be posted in the next 2 days on our YouTube page. That's a message that I'm especially sending to our friend André Bourassa. I hope he has been able to attend the session. If that's not the case, please note that the session is going to be reported, to be posted on our YouTube, as well as on the YouTube page of the Canadian International Council, National Capital Branch. The Africa Study Group is directly affiliated with the Canadian International Council, and we encourage our members to join the Canadian International Council National Capital Branch. This invitation is extended to our members and our audience, both in Canada and outside of Canada. This concludes our session today. Depending on where you are, dear friends, I wish you a good continuation of the morning, a good afternoon, and an excellent night. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye.